There was a time when television hosts were expected to maintain a perfect image, when admitting failure or embarrassment was considered career suicide in the entertainment industry. But what happened on Family Feud in January 2025 would shatter that expectation completely. When 53-year-old Patricia Morrison asked Steve Harvey a question that no contestant had ever dared to ask, she set in motion a moment of raw vulnerability that would leave the studio audience in stunned silence and Steve Harvey confronting a truth he had kept hidden for over 30 years. What he revealed in those next 15 minutes would not only expose his most embarrassing moment in show business, but would also teach millions of viewers that our failures often contain the most important lessons we can share with others. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, if you appreciate authentic moments of vulnerability and the courage it takes to admit our mistakes, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the Family Feud moments that go beyond entertainment to reveal the humanity in all of us. Patricia Morrison had spent 28 years as a high school drama teacher in Atlanta, Georgia. She had dedicated her career to helping young people find their voices on stage, teaching them that the greatest performances came not from perfection, but from authenticity and emotional truth. Her classroom walls were covered with photographs of former students who had gone on to pursue careers in theater, film, and television, each one a testament to her belief that vulnerability was strength, not weakness. Patricia's own journey in theater had been shaped by a defining moment in her youth. At 19 years old, she had auditioned for a prestigious drama program at Juilliard. She had prepared flawlessly, memorizing every line, perfecting every gesture, controlling every element of her performance. But when she stepped onto that audition stage, the panel had stopped her halfway through and told her something that would change her entire approach to performance. They said her technique was impeccable, but her performance was hollow because she was so afraid of making mistakes that she had forgotten to be human. Patricia did not get into Juilliard that year, but the rejection became the most valuable lesson of her life. She spent the next year learning to embrace imperfection, to allow herself to be vulnerable on stage, to accept that the moments when things went wrong often created the most powerful connections with audiences. When she auditioned again the following year with a performance that included an unplanned stumble and a moment where she forgot her lines, but stayed in character, she was accepted immediately. The panel told her that this time they had seen a real person, not a perfect robot. For the past 3 decades, Patricia had been teaching her students this same lesson. She would tell them that the performances they remembered most were never the ones where everything went perfectly. They were the performances where something went wrong and the actor had to adapt, where genuine emotion broke through careful planning, where humanity trumped technical perfection. Her favorite saying, which she had written on the board in her classroom, was a quote from Leonard Cohen: "There is a crack in everything. That is how the light gets in." Patricia had gathered her family for this Family Feud appearance as a way to celebrate her upcoming retirement from teaching. The Morrison family consisted of Patricia, her husband James, her daughter Elizabeth, her son-in-law Marcus, and her 24-year-old son Daniel, who was currently pursuing his own acting career in Los Angeles. They had applied for the show together, hoping to create one final adventure before Patricia closed this chapter of her life and began whatever came next. What Patricia did not anticipate was that within minutes of stepping onto that stage, she would create a moment that perfectly embodied everything she had spent 3 decades teaching. A moment where vulnerability would prove more powerful than perfection, where an admission of failure would create deeper connection than any polished performance could achieve, and where Steve Harvey himself would become both the teacher and the student in a lesson about the redemptive power of owning our most embarrassing moments. The Morrison family had performed well through the first 3 rounds, matching the strength of the competing family, the Williamson clan from Ohio. The energy between the 2 families was warm and competitive, with both groups clearly enjoying the experience. Steve Harvey had been having fun with both families, his characteristic humor flowing easily as he guided them through the game. The 4th round arrived and the question appeared on the board. Name something a celebrity would be embarrassed to have people find out about them. It was a light-hearted question designed to generate answers about minor vanities and harmless secrets that famous people might prefer to keep private. Patricia was at the podium, and when she buzzed in first and Steve turned to her with his encouraging smile, something unexpected happened. Instead of simply giving her answer to the question, Patricia paused and looked directly at Steve with an intensity that immediately shifted the energy in the room. "Steve," she said, her voice clear and steady, "before I answer this question about what celebrities would be embarrassed about, I want to ask you something. You have been in show business for over 30 years. You have had incredible success as a comedian, a host, and an entertainer. But I teach drama, and I teach my students that the most powerful stories are not about our successes, but about our failures. So I want to ask you directly, in front of all these people and these cameras, what is your most embarrassing moment in show business? What is the thing you failed at or messed up so badly that it still makes you cringe when you think about it?" The studio went completely silent. This was not part of the game. This was not how Family Feud worked. Contestants did not stop gameplay to ask the host personal questions, especially questions this direct and potentially uncomfortable. Steve Harvey stood there, his expression shifting from surprise to something more complex. He set down his cards, a gesture that signaled this was no longer just a game show moment. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every nuance of his reaction. "Patricia," Steve said slowly, "in all my years of hosting this show, I have never had a contestant ask me a personal question like that during the game. You know we are supposed to be focused on you and your family, not on me." Patricia nodded, her expression respectful but unwavering. "I understand, Steve, but here is why I am asking. I have spent 28 years teaching young people who are pursuing careers in entertainment. They see people like you on television, and they see success. They see confidence. They see someone who has made it, but they do not see the struggles, the failures, the embarrassing moments that taught you how to be who you are today. And because they do not see those things, they think that success means never failing, never being embarrassed, never making mistakes." She continued, her voice growing more passionate. "I had a student last year who was so talented, so gifted, but she quit pursuing theater after one bad audition because she was so ashamed of failing. She thought that real professionals never fail, never embarrass themselves, never have moments they wish they could take back. And I tried to tell her that everyone fails, even the most successful people in the world, but I could not prove it to her because successful people never talk about their failures." Patricia looked directly at Steve with an expression that was both challenging and compassionate. "You have this platform, Steve. Millions of people watch you every week. Young people trying to figure out if they have what it takes to pursue their dreams. And right now, you have an opportunity to tell them something they desperately need to hear. That even someone as successful as you has failed, has been embarrassed, has had moments that made you want to give up. That failure is not the opposite of success but part of the path to it." The silence in the studio was profound. Steve Harvey stood there, and for the first time in perhaps his entire hosting career, he appeared genuinely uncertain about what to do next. The producers were undoubtedly scrambling, wondering how to handle a situation that had never occurred before. The other contestants and family members stood frozen, recognizing that something significant was happening but unsure what would come next. Finally, Steve spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "Patricia, you are asking me to share something I have never talked about publicly, something I have kept private for over 30 years because I was ashamed of it." Patricia's response was immediate and gentle. "I understand that, Steve, and if you choose not to answer, I will respect that completely. But I want you to know why I am really asking. It is not about embarrassing you or putting you on the spot. It is about giving those young people watching, the ones who think they are the only ones who have ever failed or been humiliated, permission to keep trying despite their embarrassment. It is about showing them that vulnerability is not weakness but courage." Steve stood there for what felt like an eternity, clearly wrestling with a decision that would require him to expose something he had protected for decades. The audience remained silent, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a typical game show moment. Then Steve made a choice that would become one of the most powerful moments in television history. Steve Harvey took a deep breath and set down his cards completely, walking to the center of the stage where he could address the entire studio audience and the cameras directly. His expression was serious, vulnerable in a way the audience had never seen from him. "All right, Patricia," he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the smallest whisper in the studio. "You asked me a question that I have never answered publicly, and I am going to answer it. But I need everyone here to understand something first. What I am about to tell you is something I have been ashamed of for over 30 years. Something I have hidden because I thought that if people knew about it, they would think less of me. They would think I was not worthy of the success I have had." He paused, gathering himself. "But you are right, Patricia. Young people need to hear this. They need to know that failure does not disqualify you from success. It prepares you for it." Steve walked slowly across the stage, his movements deliberate as he prepared to share something deeply personal. "In 1987, I was a young comedian trying to make it in the business. I had been doing stand-up for a few years, grinding it out in small clubs, sleeping in my car between gigs because I could not afford a place to stay. I was hungry, I was determined, and I was convinced that I was one big break away from making it." The audience was completely absorbed, hanging on every word. "Then I got my shot. A talent scout saw me perform at a club in Cleveland and told me that a major television network was looking for fresh comedic talent for a new variety show. They wanted to see my audition tape. This was it. This was the moment that was going to change my life." Steve's expression showed the pain of the memory. "I prepared for that audition like my life depended on it, because in many ways it did. I wrote new material. I practiced every gesture, every pause, every punchline. I was going to be perfect. I was going to show them that Steve Harvey was ready for the big time." He continued, his voice growing heavier with emotion. "The day of the audition came, and I showed up at this studio in Los Angeles. There were network executives there, producers, other comedians who were auditioning. The pressure was enormous. But I was ready. I had my material memorized. I knew exactly what I was going to do." Steve paused, and the pain in his expression was evident. "I walked out onto that stage and I froze, completely froze. I had spent so much time memorizing my material, making sure every single word was perfect, that when I got out there and saw all those executives staring at me, my mind went completely blank. I could not remember a single joke, not one word of the material I had practiced hundreds of times." The studio was silent except for Steve's voice. I stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably only 30 seconds, just frozen in terror. Then I tried to start, and what came out of my mouth was not comedy. It was desperation. I started rambling, trying to fill the silence with anything, and the more I talked, the worse it got. I was not funny. I was not professional. I was just a terrified young man who was bombing the most important audition of his life in front of people who could make or break his career. Steve's eyes were glistening with tears. Finally, one of the executives stood up and said, "Thank you, Mr. Harvey. We have seen enough," and I knew I had blown it. I had been given my shot, my one chance to prove I belonged in the big leagues, and I had failed spectacularly. He wiped his eyes, making no attempt to hide his emotion. I walked out of that studio and sat in my car for 2 hours, crying. Not just crying about the audition, but crying about everything. About living in my car. About the years of struggle. About the fact that I had just proven that I did not have what it took to make it. I seriously considered quitting comedy that day. I thought, if I cannot handle the pressure of one audition, how am I ever going to succeed in this business? The audience was visibly moved, many wiping away their own tears. Patricia stood at the podium with tears streaming down her face, but her expression showed deep respect and gratitude for Steve's honesty. Steve continued, his voice growing stronger. "But here is what I want those young people watching to understand. That embarrassing moment, that complete and total failure, taught me something that all my successes never could have taught me. It taught me that perfection is the enemy of authenticity. I had been so focused on being perfect, on controlling every element of my performance, that I had forgotten to be real. I had forgotten to be myself. He looked directly at the camera. After that audition, I made a decision. I decided that I would never again try to be perfect. I would be authentic. I would be real. I would trust that my genuine self was more valuable than any polished performance I could manufacture. And that decision, born out of my most embarrassing moment, became the foundation of everything I have accomplished since. Steve turned to Patricia with profound respect. You asked me what my most embarrassing moment in show business was, and now you know, but you also asked why I have never talked about it publicly. The truth is, I was ashamed. I thought that admitting I had failed that badly would make people think I was a fraud, that I did not deserve the success I eventually achieved. But what you just taught me, Patricia, standing here at this podium asking that question, is that hiding our failures actually makes us frauds. Pretending we never struggled, never embarrassed ourselves, never wanted to quit, that is what makes us dishonest. Not admitting it. The studio erupted in applause, but Steve raised his hand for quiet. He was not finished. There is more to this story that I need to share. After that failed audition, I did not quit comedy. I went back to the clubs. I went back to sleeping in my car. I went back to grinding it out night after night. But I did it differently. I stopped trying to be the comedian I thought the industry wanted and started being the comedian I actually was. I stopped performing for approval and started performing from truth. Steve's voice was filled with conviction now. 2 years later, another opportunity came. Another showcase, another chance to audition for a television opportunity. And this time, I did not prepare by memorizing perfect material. I prepared by being honest. I went on that stage and I talked about my real life, about living in my car, about my struggles, about my failures. And you know what happened? I got the job. That audition led to my first television opportunity, which led to my first hosting job, which eventually led to me standing here hosting Family Feud. He looked at Patricia with deep gratitude. So thank you, Patricia. Thank you for having the courage to ask me the question I needed to answer. Thank you for reminding me that our embarrassing moments are not things to hide, but lessons to share. And thank you for using your moment on this stage to advocate for young people who need to hear that failure is not the end of their story, but often the beginning of their real journey. Then Steve did something unprecedented. He walked over to Patricia and hugged her, a genuine embrace that transcended the typical game show interaction. When he stepped back, he addressed the entire studio and the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to finish this game. Patricia is going to give her answer to the original question. But I want everyone watching to understand that what just happened here was more important than any game. Patricia Morrison just reminded all of us that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the strongest thing we can offer each other. ACT 50 Luddy 1620 minutes. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, the response was immediate and extraordinary. The segment went viral within hours, but it sparked something different from typical viral entertainment moments. This was not about shock value or humor. It was about vulnerability, authenticity, and the courage it takes to admit our failures publicly. Within 72 hours, mental health organizations focused on young performers reported a significant increase in calls from aspiring actors, comedians, and entertainers who had been considering quitting after failures or rejections. Talent agencies and performing arts schools began incorporating the clip into their training programs, using Steve's story as a teaching tool about resilience and authentic performance. Steve Harvey kept his commitment to using his platform differently. 2 weeks after the episode aired, he announced a new initiative across all his shows. He would be regularly featuring segments where successful people in entertainment, business, sports, and other fields shared their most embarrassing failures and what those moments taught them. The segment would be called The Patricia Morrison Question, honoring the drama teacher who had the courage to ask what everyone wondered but no one dared to say. The first episode of The Patricia Morrison Question featured Steve himself in an extended interview where he went into even greater detail about his failed audition and the years of struggle that followed. He shared photographs from that period of his life, including pictures of the car he lived in and the small comedy clubs where he performed. He talked about the shame he felt, the times he wanted to quit, and the decision to choose authenticity over perfection that had ultimately saved his career. But the most powerful testimony came from current comedians and entertainers who revealed how Steve's story had impacted them. A young comedian named Jordan Matthews described how he had seen the Family Feud clip the night before he was scheduled to quit comedy after a series of brutal failures. "I had convinced myself that I did not have what it took," Jordan said. "But when I saw Steve Harvey, someone I had always thought was naturally talented and effortlessly successful, admit that he had frozen on stage and bombed the biggest audition of his early career, something shifted. I realized that my failures did not mean I was not meant to do this. They meant I was learning." Jordan revealed that he had decided to keep pursuing comedy, and 6 months later, he had gotten his first significant television opportunity. "I tell Steve's story before every performance now," he said. "I remind myself that authenticity beats perfection every single time." 3 months after the episode aired, Patricia received thousands of letters from teachers, students, and aspiring performers. One letter particularly moved her. It was from a 16-year-old girl named Maya who wrote, "I quit theater last year after I forgot my lines in the school play. I was so embarrassed that I could not face going back. But my drama teacher showed our class the Family Feud clip where you asked Steve Harvey about his most embarrassing moment, and when he told the story about freezing in his audition, I realized something. If Steve Harvey could fail that badly and still become Steve Harvey, then maybe my failure did not mean I had to quit. I auditioned for this year's play, and I got the lead role. Thank you for asking the question that gave me permission to fail and keep going." Patricia shared Maya's letter with Steve during her appearance on his talk show, and Steve read it on air with tears in his eyes. "This is why I do what I do," he said. "Not for the ratings or the recognition, but for moments like this. When Maya writes that our conversation gave her permission to fail and keep going, that is success. That is what matters." 6 months after the episode aired, performing arts schools across the country began implementing a new tradition inspired by Patricia's question. During their opening orientations, they would show the Family Feud clip and then ask every incoming student to write about their most embarrassing failure and what they learned from it. The exercise, which became known as the Patricia Morrison assignment, helped create cultures of vulnerability and authenticity rather than toxic perfectionism. One drama professor at NYU described the transformation. "Before we started using this approach, our students were terrified of making mistakes. They would rather give safe, controlled performances than risk failure. But after watching Steve Harvey admit to freezing in the biggest audition of his early career, they realized that the greatest performers are not the ones who never fail, but the ones who learn from failure and keep going." Our productions have become more authentic, more emotionally powerful, because our students are no longer performing from fear but from truth. 1 year after the episode aired, Steve Harvey hosted a special reunion show featuring both the Morrison family and dozens of people whose lives had been changed by Patricia's question and Steve's answer. The show had evolved into a broader conversation about failure, resilience, and the importance of vulnerability in achieving authentic success. During the reunion, Steve revealed something that surprised everyone. "After Patricia asked me that question, I went home and I called my kids. I told them stories about my failures that I had never shared before because I was embarrassed. I wanted them to see me as strong, as successful, as someone who had always known what I was doing. But Patricia taught me that the strongest thing I could show my children was my vulnerability. My willingness to admit when I had failed, when I had been terrified, when I had wanted to quit." He continued with visible emotion. "My daughter told me that hearing those stories made her respect me more, not less. She said that she had always felt pressure to be perfect because she thought I had been perfect, but knowing that I had failed and kept going gave her permission to fail and keep going too. That is the gift Patricia gave me, not just the opportunity to be vulnerable with millions of strangers, but the reminder to be vulnerable with the people I love most." Patricia shared her own revelation during the reunion. When I asked Steve that question, I was thinking about my students and young people pursuing entertainment careers. But what I did not expect was how it would impact people in every field. I have received letters from doctors who watched their first patient die and wanted to quit medicine, from teachers who had terrible first years in the classroom and considered leaving education, from entrepreneurs who failed at their first businesses and thought they were not cut out for success. The lesson that failure is part of the path, not evidence that you are on the wrong path, that resonates across every aspect of life. The reunion episode included testimony from psychologists and career counselors about the impact the original episode had created. Dr. Michael Chen, a psychologist specializing in performance anxiety, explained, "What Steve Harvey did when he shared his story of freezing in that audition was normalize an experience that millions of people have but think they are alone in experiencing. Performance anxiety, fear of failure, the terror of being exposed as not good enough, these are universal human experiences. But we rarely see successful people admit to them." Steve's vulnerability gave people permission to acknowledge their own fears without shame. 5 years later, the impact continued to compound in ways that exceeded anyone's initial expectations. The Patricia Morrison question had become a regular segment not just on Steve's shows but on dozens of other talk shows, podcasts, and media platforms. Successful people across industries were being asked to share their most embarrassing failures, and the responses were creating a cultural shift in how society thought about success. Patricia herself had retired from high school teaching but had launched a consulting practice, helping performing arts programs create cultures of authentic vulnerability rather than toxic perfectionism. She traveled the country delivering workshops and keynote speeches about the power of asking difficult questions and the courage it takes to answer them honestly. During one keynote address at a performing arts conference, Patricia reflected on that moment on Family Feud with characteristic wisdom. "When I asked Steve Harvey about his most embarrassing moment, I did not know what he would say. I did not know if he would answer at all. But I knew that the question needed to be asked because our culture of celebrating only success and hiding failure was crushing young people who thought they were the only ones struggling." She continued with deep conviction, "What Steve taught me that day was that the willingness to be vulnerable is not just personal courage. It is social responsibility. When you have achieved success and you hide the failures that got you there, you create an impossible standard for everyone coming behind you. But when you share your struggles, your embarrassments, your moments of wanting to quit, you create a path that others can follow. You give them permission to be human." 10 years after that memorable Family Feud episode, a comprehensive academic study was published examining the cultural impact of the moment. The study documented measurable changes in how performing arts programs approached failure, how talent agencies evaluated potential clients, and how the entertainment industry discussed rejection and resilience. Researchers found that applications to performing arts programs had increased significantly, with students citing the normalization of failure as a key factor in their decision to pursue careers in entertainment despite the high risk of rejection. The study also examined social media conversations about failure and success before and after the episode aired. Prior to the episode, online discussions about pursuing entertainment careers were dominated by survivorship bias, with successful people sharing their triumphs but rarely their failures. After the episode, the conversation had shifted dramatically to include extensive discussions about learning from rejection, growing through embarrassment, and recognizing that failure was not the opposite of success but often the prerequisite for it. In the study's conclusion, the researchers wrote, "The Patricia Morrison question and Steve Harvey's vulnerable response created what we term a permission structure for public acknowledgement of failure. By demonstrating that even highly successful individuals have experienced profound embarrassment and learned from it rather than being destroyed by it, they gave millions of people permission to reframe their own failures as learning experiences rather than evidence of inadequacy." A documentary was produced examining the far-reaching impact of those 15 minutes on Family Feud. The documentary traced the stories of hundreds of people whose lives or careers had been influenced by Patricia's question and Steve's answer. An aspiring actress described how watching the clip had given her the courage to audition again after a devastating rejection. An entrepreneur talked about how the episode had helped him reframe his first business failure as education rather than evidence that he should quit. A teacher explained how she had used the clip to help struggling students understand that learning requires risk and that mistakes are information, not indictment. In the documentary's closing scene, Steve and Patricia appear together at Patricia's former high school, speaking to current drama students about vulnerability, failure, and authentic success. Steve tells the students his complete story, including details he had never shared publicly before about the years of struggle, the moments of doubt, and the decision to choose authenticity over perfection that had ultimately defined his career. Then Patricia offers her perspective with the wisdom of someone who has spent decades teaching young people to find their voices. The question I asked Steve that day on Family Feud was not really about his most embarrassing moment. It was about permission. Permission for all of you sitting here, all the young people watching at home, to fail without being failures. To be embarrassed without being defined by embarrassment. To struggle without interpreting that struggle as evidence that you are not meant to succeed. She continues with conviction that fills the room. Steve's answer gave you that permission. His willingness to be vulnerable about his most embarrassing moment taught you that vulnerability is not weakness, but the strongest form of honesty there is. And my hope is that you will carry that lesson forward, that when you achieve your own success, whatever that looks like, you will remember to share not just your triumphs, but your struggles, because that is how we create a world where young people can take risks without fear that failure will disqualify them from their dreams. The documentary ends with a powerful montage of people from all walks of life sharing their own most embarrassing moments and what those experiences taught them. Teachers, doctors, entrepreneurs, artists, athletes, and everyday people offering their stories of failure and growth. The montage demonstrates that Patricia's question and Steve's answer had created a ripple effect far beyond entertainment, touching every aspect of human endeavor where people take risks and sometimes fall short. As the screen fades to black, Steve's voice offers a final reflection. Patricia Morrison taught me that my most embarrassing moment was not something to hide but something to share, that my failure in that audition 30 years ago was not the end of my story, but the beginning of my real education about what matters in this business and in life. Authenticity over perfection. Vulnerability over pretense. Truth over image. Those are the lessons born from embarrassment, and those are the lessons worth sharing. The story of Patricia Morrison's daring question and Steve Harvey's vulnerable answer reminds us that our most embarrassing moments often contain our most important lessons, that success built on hiding our failures is ultimately hollow, while success that acknowledges and learns from failure is authentic and sustainable. That the courage to be vulnerable about our struggles gives others permission to persist through their own. And that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do with our platform is admit that we do not have it all figured out, that we have failed spectacularly, and that those failures taught us more than our successes ever could. If this story resonated with you and reminded you that your failures do not disqualify you from success, but prepare you for it, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share these powerful moments because they challenge us to embrace vulnerability and inspire us to keep pursuing our dreams despite setbacks. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their most embarrassing moment might become their most important teacher. And remember that the next time you face failure or embarrassment, you have a choice about what that experience means. You can allow it to define you as inadequate, or you can learn from it and keep moving forward with greater wisdom and authenticity than you had before. Choose wisely, choose courageously, and choose the path that honors both your struggles and your dreams.